I swear I didn't go looking for anything that night. I just woke up. No reason, just one of those random wake-ups in the middle of the night. The bedroom was dark except for the soft glow of her phone screen on the nightstand. I wouldn't have even noticed it if it hadn't lit up right as I rolled over. Isabel's phone, unattended, unlocked. And there it was, a message. "I can't wait to see you, you're amazing." It wasn't from anyone I knew. Declan Miller, not a name that rang any bells. My heart sank, and a strange numbness crept over me. I sat up, trying to keep my breathing even. My first thought was maybe it was some harmless mistake, like spam or a wrong number. But the way my gut twisted told me otherwise. I should have put the phone down right then and there. But I couldn't. I tapped the message, and everything spilled out in front of me. Weeks of chat logs, flirty messages, intimate pictures exchanged late at night. "Had such a good time last Thursday," one message read. That was the night Isabel told me she was working late. Another message referred to that beach trip. I remembered it perfectly. It was our daughter Lydia's 8th birthday weekend. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling deeper, my hands cold and clammy. She had spent that whole weekend acting normal. No, better than normal. I remembered her holding Lydia's hand as they walked along the shoreline, laughing at my terrible attempts at kite flying. She even pulled me in for a photo that day, planting a kiss on my cheek. But here, in these messages, she was talking about that same weekend as if it had been some secret getaway with him. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My wife wasn't just texting some guy. She was sleeping with him. I could hear her slow, steady breathing next to me, completely unaware that I was unraveling right there in the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to wake her up, shove the phone in her face, demand answers. But I didn't. I forced myself to put the phone back exactly where it was and lay down, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay calm, Caleb. Don't tip her off." When the alarm went off the next morning, I was already awake. I dragged myself out of bed, heading straight to the kitchen to make breakfast, just like I always did. Isabel strolled in a little later, looking refreshed, a sleepy smile on her face. She kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened. "Morning, babe," she said cheerfully, pulling out plates from the cupboard. "Morning," I replied, my voice tighter than I'd intended. She didn't notice. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table with Lydia, who was excitedly telling her about some projects she was working on at school. I tried to focus on their conversation, but my mind was a storm of questions. Isabel looked so normal. How could she sit there, all smiles, chatting with our daughter after spending nights in another man's bed? She glanced at me, her expression relaxed and content, as if everything in our world was perfectly fine. For a split second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the weight of the truth settled back over me like a stone tied to my chest. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, watching Isabel with new eyes. I noticed things I hadn't before, or maybe I'd just ignored them. She stayed late at work a lot. When she got home, she was quick to give me a peck on the lips and disappear into her phone. I'd asked her a few times why she seemed so distant, but she always had some excuse, just tired or work's been crazy. But now, with what I knew, it was clear. I wasn't the problem. She had someone else. At one point during the day, I wandered out into the front yard. Martina Campbell, our neighbor, was watering her garden and waved me over. "Hey, Caleb, Isabel's been looking great lately. That new hair color really suits her." "New hair color?" I blinked, thrown off for a moment. Isabel hadn't mentioned getting her hair done. "Yeah, it does," I mumbled, playing along, but Martina's words made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the hair, it was everything. Her clothes had changed, too. More form-fitting, more daring. I thought it was just her trying to feel good about herself again after having Lydia. But now, with everything I'd uncovered, it felt like I'd been living in some parallel version of our life. One where everything was the same on the surface, but underneath, things were rotten. I could have confronted her that night. Every time she glanced at her phone, I felt a sharp sting in my chest, wondering if it was him texting her. But something held me back. I needed more than just a gut feeling and a few texts. If I exploded on her now, she'd just lie and twist things around. I needed proof. So I played the waiting game. I didn't change my behavior, didn't treat her any differently, at least not in ways she'd notice. But every time she left her phone lying around, I'd sneak a quick look, gathering as much as I could. I also installed a tracking app, one of those hidden ones that mirrored her phone notifications to mine. Now, I would see everything she did in real time. That night, I lay beside her again, wide awake while she slept soundly next to me. Her hand rested lightly on my chest like it always did, and for a second, I felt a pang of something close to guilt. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation for all this? But then I remembered those messages, those goddamn photos of them together. The way he talked about her, like she was his. No, Caleb, you're not crazy. She's the one betraying you. Still, it was surreal. Isabel had been my best friend, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. And now, every time I looked at her, all I saw was lies. Lydia's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her little brows furrowed with concern. I forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie. Just thinking about stuff." She nodded, but the look in her eyes told me she knew something was off. And so the first cracks began to form, not just in my marriage, but in my whole life. I didn't confront her right away. Part of me wanted to throw the phone in her face, scream at her, and demand answers. But I knew how these things went. If I acted on impulse, she'd lie, twist things around, turn it back on me. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed proof. So I waited. I played dumb. I kept my routine exactly the same. The night after I found the messages, I installed a hidden app on her phone. It was one of those discreet ones that mirrored all her texts and notifications to mine. Every time her phone buzzed, I got a notification too. It made me sick to my stomach, knowing that her next message could be from him. But I needed to see everything. I also checked our shared photo album and the GPS history on her phone, digging through every detail I could find. The pattern became obvious pretty quickly. Isabel had a habit of visiting Riverside, a neighborhood across town. There was no reason for her to be there. None that she'd ever mentioned anyway. I could only guess that's where Declan lived. Every time she was working late or out with friends, she ended up there. It was like living in someone else's nightmare. I'd sit at work, phone in hand, watching notifications roll in, pretending like everything was fine while my wife was out there with him. One time, when I saw she'd arrived in Riverside again, I clenched my phone so hard I thought it might shatter. The worst part wasn't the messages or the photos. It was how comfortable they were with each other. They talked about inside jokes, shared little stories from their days, things that she used to share with me. The emotional connection stung almost worse than the physical betrayal. Then came the night she said she was going to yoga with one of her friends. Isabel rarely went to yoga, and when she did, it was always on weekends. My gut told me something was off. "Yoga class tonight?" I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter as she packed her gym bag. "Yeah," she said without missing a beat. "It's been a while. Emma keeps bugging me to come with her." I gave her a nod and forced a smile. "Have fun." As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, if she even cared enough to look. Sure enough, she didn't go to any yoga studio. I followed her all the way to a small cafe tucked into the corner of Riverside. And there he was, Declan. She spotted him the moment she walked in, her whole face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She slid into the booth across from him, and the two of them leaned in close, their legs brushing under the table. They were laughing, touching hands, acting like giddy teenagers sneaking out of class. She looked happy. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Watching them like that, it felt like someone had reached into my chest and crushed my heart. Seeing her with him, so at ease, so free, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I wanted to storm in, flip the table, and confront them both right there. But I didn't. I just sat there, paralyzed, watching them flirt and touch like it was the most natural thing in the world. When she finally left the cafe, she had a glow about her. The same glow she used to have when we first started dating. But now it wasn't for me. It was for him. That night, I lay beside her again, wide awake while she slept like nothing had happened. Her breathing was soft and steady, and her hand brushed against mine under the blanket. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever be able to forgive her. Could I really move past this? Could I ever look at her the same way again? I didn't have an answer. Over the next few days, Isabel started picking up on my mood. I could see her eyes lingering on me longer, watching for any sign that something was off. I did my best to act normal, but it wasn't easy. I kept getting lost in my own thoughts, replaying every moment of our relationship in my head, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. I spent more time at work, throwing myself into projects that didn't even matter. When I was home, I'd stay late in the garage, tinkering with tools I hadn't touched in years. "Everything okay, Caleb?" she asked one evening as I stood at the sink, scrubbing a dish that was already clean. "Yeah, just tired," I mumbled. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't push. "Not yet." Lydia was the only one brave enough to call me out on it. One night, as I tucked her in a bed, she looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes of hers. "Dad, why are you sad?" she asked, her little voice full of concern. I felt my throat tighten. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," I lied, brushing a hand over her hair. "Just thinking about grown-up stuff." She didn't look convinced, but she snuggled deeper into her blankets and let it go. Isabel, on the other hand, was getting suspicious. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out what was going on with me. She started asking more questions, trying to engage me in conversations that felt forced. She'd sit next to me on the couch, curling into my side, asking about my day like she gave a damn. It was like she was trying to feel me out, figure out if I knew anything. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I distanced myself even further. I kept my answers short and vague, just enough to keep her from digging too deep. The less I said, the more uncomfortable she got. She knew something was up, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And that was exactly what I wanted. The dynamic in our house shifted. Where once there had been laughter and easy conversations, there was now tension, thick and suffocating. Every interaction felt like a test, a game of chess where we both tried to outmaneuver each other without saying what we really meant. I spent more nights in the garage pretending to work on meaningless projects. Sometimes I'd just sit there, staring at the tools scattered across the workbench, thinking about how my life had turned into this mess. I used to love being home, love spending time with my family. Now it felt like a battleground, and every moment with Isabel was another reminder of how everything I thought we had was a lie. And yet, I still wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed her to feel just as vulnerable as I did, to wonder what I knew and when I might finally explode. The waiting game was brutal, but it was the only way I could stay in control. She thought she had the upper hand, thought I was clueless. But the truth was, I was watching her every move, tracking her every step. And when the time came, I'd be ready. Exposing Isabel's affair wouldn't be enough. I could see that clearly now. I could catch her red-handed, throw every bit of evidence in her face, and watch her squirm. But what would that change? She'd be embarrassed, sure, but she wouldn't feel what I felt. She wouldn't know what it's like to be gutted from the inside out, watching the person you love turn their affection towards someone else. No, that wasn't enough. I needed her to feel everything I was feeling. I didn't plan on meeting Savannah Marlowe. It just happened. The bar was close to my office, and one night after a particularly shitty day, I stopped in, hoping a drink might dull some of the noise in my head. Savannah was working the bar, wiping down glasses with an easy smile that lit up her whole face. She looked young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and tattoos peeking out from under her sleeves. "What'll it be?" she asked, glancing at me with a curious grin, like she knew I didn't belong there. "Bourbon," I muttered, sliding onto a stool. She poured my drink and set it down with a little more grace than I'd expected. "Rough day?" I just nodded. I wasn't in the mood to talk, but Savannah had a way of pulling words out of me without even trying. She didn't pry. She just talked about her day, the weird customers she'd dealt with, and how she was saving up to travel the country in a beat-up and she was fixing up with her brother. I found myself opening up, telling her little bits about my life, how work had been dragging, how things at home weren't great. I didn't mention Isabel. Not yet. I didn't need to. Savannah had this easy way about her that made it feel like none of that mattered in the moment. I went back to the bar the next night, and the night after that. Before long, stopping by for a drink became part of my routine. At first, I told myself it was innocent, just someone to talk to, someone who didn't know the mess my life had become. But with each visit, The flirting between us grew more obvious. Savannah would lean in closer when she spoke, her hand brushing mine as she passed me my drink. And I didn't pull away. She never asked too many questions, just let me be whoever I needed to be in that moment. When she laughed, it felt real, like she wasn't holding back for anyone. Being around her was a relief, like I could step out of my own skin for a little while and just breathe. One night, after a few drinks, she leaned on the bar, her eyes locking onto mine. You know, I don't see guys like you in here very often. Guys like me? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You look like you've got your shit together, she said with a smirk. But there's something else. Something heavy. I just shrugged, swirling the bourbon in my glass. Life, I guess. She didn't press, just smiled that easy smile of hers. Well, here's to life. She clinked her glass against mine, and for a moment, the weight on my chest didn't feel quite as heavy. I wasn't stupid. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't just hanging out at the bar for the atmosphere. I wanted Isabel to find out. I wanted her to wonder what I was up to when I wasn't home, to feel that same creeping suspicion I'd lived with for months. It didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading. I started dropping hints to mutual friends, nothing obvious, just little comments here and there. I've been spending time with someone new, I'd say casually, knowing the gossip would spread like wildfire. I didn't care who knew. In fact, the more people who knew, the better. One evening, I ran into Martina Campbell at the bar. She nearly dropped her drink when she saw me sitting there, chatting with Savannah like we were old friends. "Caleb," she asked, eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Having a drink," I replied with a shrug, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Martina looked from me to Savannah and back again, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Does Isabel know you're here?" I gave her a smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile at all. "Why? You gonna tell her?" Martina blinked, clearly thrown off by my tone. This isn't like you, Caleb. People change," I said flatly, raising my glass to my lips. Martina huffed, crossing her arms. "She's your wife, Caleb." "Yeah, well, I'm sure Isabel's doing just fine without me," I said, my voice laced with bitterness. Martina stared at me for a moment, her expression shifting from shock to something more like pity. "I'm going to talk to her," she said finally, as if she thought she could fix whatever was happening between us. "Go ahead," I muttered, not bothering to stop her. "Let her talk. Let Isabel know exactly where I was, who I was with." Savannah raised an eyebrow as Martina stormed out of the bar, shaking her head. "Friend of yours?" "Something like that," I said, finishing my drink. Savannah didn't ask any more questions. She just smiled, and we went back to talking about nothing and everything like we always did. That night, as I drove home, a strange kind of satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't just about getting back at Isabel. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost somewhere along the way. I didn't know where this thing with Savannah was going, and honestly, I didn't care. All I knew was that for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some control. I wanted Isabel to feel the same gut-wrenching uncertainty I'd felt. I wanted her to wonder if I was thinking about someone else when I kissed her goodnight. And if Martina's reaction was anything to go by, I was well on my way to making that happen. The game had only just begun, and for the first time in months, I wasn't playing defense anymore. It happened sooner than I expected. One night, while I was at the bar with Savannah, enjoying the rare sensation of lightness, Isabel stormed in. I didn't see her coming. One second, Savannah and I were laughing over some silly joke, and the next, I heard Isabel's voice cut through the low hum of the bar like a blade. "So this is where you've been hiding." I looked up, and there she was, Isabel, standing in the entrance, scanning the room until her eyes locked on mine. Her face twisted in rage, lips pressed into a tight line. She marched toward us like a woman possessed, fury radiating off her. Every head in the bar turned as she approached. "Who the fuck is she?" Isabel demanded, pointing at Savannah with a wild look in her eyes. Her voice was loud, sharp, and bitter, impossible to ignore. Savannah froze, visibly uncomfortable, her carefree demeanor evaporating in an instant. She shot me a glance, clearly wondering what kind of mess she had just walked into. "Isabel, don't do this here," I said, keeping my voice even, though my heart was pounding in my chest. She wasn't having any of it. She stepped closer, glaring at Savannah. You think this is funny? Flirting with a married man? You think that's cute? Savannah raised her hands defensively and stood up. I didn't know. Bullshit. Isabel snapped, cutting her off. Don't act like some innocent bystander. Isabel, I warned, back off. Isabel ignored me. She turned to the growing crowd of onlookers, her voice growing louder. This asshole's been sneaking around behind my back, cheating on me with this tramp. I leaned back in my seat, arms crossed, forcing myself to stay calm. This was what she wanted, to make me react, to make me feel like I was the one at fault. How does it feel? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on hers. How does it feel to be betrayed? She faltered for a moment, taken off guard. For a second, I saw it, the guilt, the fear, before the mask slipped back into place. You ruined this family, Caleb, she hissed, her voice low but venomous. I stood slowly, making sure to keep my movements deliberate. No, Isabel, I said calmly. You ruined it the moment you started fucking Declan. The bar went dead silent. Martina, who had been sitting at the other end of the bar, stared at us, wide-eyed. She looked like she was watching a slow-motion car crash and couldn't tear her eyes away. Isabel's face paled for just a second, but then she snarled, "That's different. He was just a distraction." Savannah, embarrassed and clearly wanting no part in this disaster, muttered, "I think I should go." She grabbed her things and slipped away, leaving me and Isabel standing in the center of the room, surrounded by people who were now witnessing the complete unraveling of our marriage. Isabel turned back to me, eyes wild. "You're a coward, Caleb. You sneak around and flirt with some bar girl to make yourself feel better? That's fucking pathetic." I smiled bitterly, not rising to her bait. Is it? Or is it just karma? When we got home, the argument exploded into full force. Isabel slammed the door behind her and spun around to face me. "You really think flirting with some bartender makes you a man?" she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is how you solve our problems?" "No, Isabel," I said quietly. "But it sure as hell feels good to watch you squirm." She glared at me, her chest heaving. "Declan didn't mean anything. I was lonely, Caleb. You were never there for me." "Don't give me that crap," I shot back. "You chose to cheat. Don't try to twist it into something it's not." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the folder where I'd saved everything, and held it up. "You want to explain these? The photos? The messages? Or maybe the GPS pings showing every time you went to Riverside?" Her face crumbled as she realized there was no way out. She wasn't in control anymore. Her excuses, her lies, they all fell apart in an instant. "It was just a distraction," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Well, congrats," I said, my voice cold. "You distracted yourself out of a marriage." She sobbed, clinging to whatever shred of dignity she had left. "Kayla, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. We can fix this. We can try again." But I was done. Whatever love I had for her had been eaten away by months of lies and betrayal. Martina showed up at the house the next day, hoping to mediate or talk some sense into me. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her expression full of concern. "I know you're hurt, Caleb, but maybe there's still something worth saving. For Lydia's sake, if nothing else." I shook my head. "I can't live like this, Martina. I can't wake up every day wondering if she's lying to me again. I won't do it." "People make mistakes," Martina said softly. "Isabel, she's just human. She made her choice," I replied, my voice firm. "And I'm making mine." Martina sighed, realizing there was nothing more to say. "I just hate to see things end like this." "Trust me," I muttered. It ended the day she decided to crawl into bed with someone else. Martina left not long after, leaving me alone in the silence of the house. Isabel was there somewhere, probably crying, probably coming up with new excuses or apologies. But none of it mattered anymore. The trust was gone, and once that's gone, there's no getting it back. There was a strange sense of clarity in knowing that. I knew it was time. There was no point dragging this out any longer. The lies, the betrayal, it had all hollowed out whatever love I had left for Isabel. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the same way. Now, I just felt exhausted, like I'd been running a marathon with no finish line in sight. But this This dinner would be the end. I'd made up my mind. I would hand her the divorce papers, close the book on us, and finally be free. I booked a table at the restaurant where we had celebrated our first anniversary all those years ago. I didn't choose it for sentimental reasons. I chose it because it felt symbolic, a way to bring things full circle and finally lay them to rest. This marriage had been dead for a while now. It was just time to make it official. That evening, as I pulled on my jacket, Lydia stood in the doorway of my room, clutching one of her stuffed animals. Her big, curious eyes watched me closely, and I could see the questions swirling in her little head. "Dad," she said softly, hugging the stuffed bear tighter to her chest. "Do you and Mom still love each other?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my hands hovering over my collar. And for a second, I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something so complicated to an 8-year-old? I crouched down in front of her, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "I will always love you. No matter what happens, you are the most important thing in the world to me." She frowned, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "But, do you love Mom?" I hugged her tightly, trying to hold back the knot in my throat. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "grown-ups love each other in different ways. And sometimes, that love changes." Lydia didn't say anything, just rested her head on my shoulder. I held her for a moment longer, wishing I could shield her from the mess that her mother and I had made. "I love you," I whispered into her hair, and I meant it more than anything. That will never change. When I arrived at the restaurant, Isabel was already seated, sipping a glass of water. She smiled when she saw me, but it was strained, like she wasn't sure what kind of conversation we were about to have. I slid into the chair across from her, placing my bag carefully by my side. "Hi," she said cautiously, her eyes scanning my face. "You look nice." I nodded but didn't return the compliment. For a few minutes, we sat in awkward silence. Then, as if trying to bridge the distance between us, Isabel started talking, reminiscing about old times, about when things were good. She mentioned our honeymoon, the first house we bought, Lydia's birth. Moments that, once upon a time, had meant everything to me. But now, they felt like memories that belonged to someone else. I didn't respond much, just sipped my wine and nodded at the right moments. My mind was elsewhere, focused on the papers tucked neatly inside my bag. The longer Isabel talked, the more it became clear that she was desperately trying to hold on to something that was already gone. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, I decided I'd had enough. I reached into my bag, pulled out the divorce papers, and placed them on the table between us. Her smile faltered, and she stared at the papers like they were a bomb about to go off. "This evening doesn't mean anything to me anymore," I said coldly, looking her directly in the eye. Isabel's hand trembled as she reached for the papers. "Kayla, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, my expression unchanging. "There's nothing left to fix." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel anything. No sympathy, no regret. Just emptiness. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "We can try again. For Lydia. For us." I took the pen from my pocket, clicked it, and signed the papers right in front of her without hesitation. Then I pushed them across the table and stood. "It's over, Isabel," I said, my voice firm but emotionless. "I can't live like this anymore." She sat there, stunned, her glass of wine half finished, her hands trembling as they hovered over the papers. For a moment, I thought she might say something else. One final plea, one last desperate attempt to change my mind. But she didn't. I turned and walked away without another word, leaving her sitting alone at the table. I didn't look back. I couldn't. In the hallway, just as I reached the exit, I ran into Martina. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and she gave me a look that was equal parts surprise and concern. "Caleb," she said softly, "you really went through with it?" I nodded, my expression unreadable. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice gentle, as if she thought I might waver at the last second. For the first time in my life, I said quietly, "I am absolutely sure." Martina studied my face for a moment, then gave me a sad smile. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for, she said softly. I didn't respond. I just gave her a small nod and walked out into the night, feeling lighter than I had in months. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just closure. The chapter with Isabel was finally over. Packing my things wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I'd imagined it might feel heavy, like I was ripping myself away from the life I'd built. But it didn't. It felt necessary, like shedding old skin. The house was too full of memories I didn't want anymore. Isabel's perfume clinging to the furniture, pictures from happier days scattered throughout the place, reminders of every broken promise. I stuffed clothes into bags, loaded a few boxes into the back of my car, and left without ceremony. I moved into a small apartment in the city center. It wasn't fancy, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of a laundromat, but it was mine. There was something comforting about starting over with nothing but the essentials. No ghosts lurking in the corners, no memories weighing me down. It felt clean. The hardest part was explaining it to Lydia. I promised her I wasn't going anywhere, that we'd still spend weekends together, and that she'd always be my #1 priority. She nodded solemnly, trying to be brave, but I could see the worry in her little face. It killed me that my decisions had hurt her, but I swore to myself that no matter what, I'd be there for her. I wouldn't let her feel abandoned. The weeks after the divorce passed in a strange blur. I focused on work, on making my new place feel like home, and on being the best dad I could be. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending. Then, one rainy afternoon, I ran into Savannah. I was heading back to my apartment, groceries in hand, when I saw her across the street, holding an umbrella and wearing that same easy smile. "Caleb," she called out, jogging over to meet me. "I thought that was you." I couldn't help but grin. "Hey, Savannah." We stood there for a moment, awkward but comfortable at the same time, rain tapping lightly against her umbrella. "You look different," she said, tilting her head as she studied me. "Different how?" I asked. She shrugged. "Lighter. Happier, maybe." I laughed, though it still felt strange to hear someone say that. "Divorce will do that to you, I guess." Her eyes softened. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be," I said, meaning it. It needed to happen. Savannah smiled, and for a moment, we just stood there in the drizzle, neither of us in a rush to leave. "You want to grab a coffee?" she asked, her tone casual but hopeful. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." Coffee turned into more coffee, and before I knew it, meeting Savannah became part of my routine again. It wasn't like before, though. This time, there were no games, no hidden motives. We just talked about life, about her van project, about anything and everything. She didn't press for details about Isabel, and I appreciated that. Being with her felt like a breath of fresh air, like I was finally allowed to move on without dragging the past behind me. One weekend, I had Lydia with me, and we ran into Savannah at the park. Lydia was shy at first, hiding behind my leg, but Savannah crouched down, smiling warmly. "Hey, you must be Lydia," she said. "Your dad's told me all about you." Lydia peeked out, curious but still wary. "He has?" "Yup," Savannah said with a wink. "He said you're the best artist around." That was all it took. Lydia's face lit up, and within minutes, the two of them were sitting together on a bench, talking about crayons and drawing contests. Watching them interact, I felt something settle in my chest, a sense of peace I hadn't known I was missing. Maybe this was what moving on looked like, not just for me, but for Lydia too. Of course, Isabel wasn't finished with me. A few weeks later, she called, asking if we could meet. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. We sat across from each other at a cafe, the same tension between us that had defined the last few months of our marriage. She looked tired, like the weight of her mistakes had finally caught up with her. She began, struggling to find the right words. "I want to say I'm sorry, Caleb. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." I nodded but said nothing. "I was lonely," she continued, her voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking straight, but I never stopped loving you. Can we try again? For Lydia's sake?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Part of me had wondered what this moment would feel like, if I'd feel vindicated or if some small part of me would still want her back. But as I looked at her, I realized I didn't feel any of that. I felt nothing. Thank you for the experience, I said calmly. I became stronger because of it. But you stayed in a place I no longer want to be. Her face crumpled, but I didn't waver. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just done. When I got back to my apartment that evening, Savannah was waiting on the balcony, 2 beers in hand. She smiled as I stepped outside, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin. How'd it go? She asked, handing me a beer. Exactly how it needed to, I said, sitting beside her. We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city flicker on one by one. Savannah reached over and laced her fingers through mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The past didn't matter anymore. It was behind me, right where it belonged. Just as I was about to take another sip of my beer, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from Lydia. Hey, sweetie, I answered, my voice warm. Dad, guess what? She said excitedly, holding up a piece of paper. I won the drawing contest at school. I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. That's amazing, Lydia. I knew you could do it. She beamed, her joy radiating through the screen. In that moment, sitting on the balcony with Savannah by my side and Lydia's laughter filling my ears, I knew I'd made it. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and I was finally, truly free.